Welcome everybody to Torch's Book at Lunchtime, and we're continuing to celebrate our 13th Michaelmas term, and we have a Shakespeare double bill, so it's two for the price of one today, which is really excellent. Those of you who are regular attenders will know that Book at Lunchtime is a flagship event that Torch has been running for many years now, and we've discussed within this event an astonishing range of books, and they're all recorded on YouTube videos. So anybody who wants the back catalogue can go and look there for that. And today, the two authors that we have will be discussing their respective works, and these authors are Dr Amy Lidster, my colleague from Oxford's English faculty, and Dr Monika Smialkowska from the University of Northumbria. And both of them have written on interpretations and reception of Shakespeare in interestingly complementary, but I think very different ways. So Amy's book is Wartime Shakespeare, Performing Narratives of Conflict, and Monika's is Shakespeare's Tercentenary, Staging Nations and Performing Identities in 1916. And I just want to read a few snippets from some very warm reviews of these works to give a sense of the reception which these volumes received when they were published. So I quote, Amy Lidster uniquely transforms the history of wartime Shakespeare into a narrative that convinces, due to its apt emphasis on the fragmented, provisional and multi-layered nature of this complex phenomenon. Amy Lidster convincingly demonstrates how production and reception agents create a wartime Shakespeare more ideologically contested and less consistently jingoistic than we have recognised. Leading us from the Essex Uprising in 1601 to the Iraq War at the dawn of the 21st century, Lidster is an able guide to a history of Shakespeare productions as open to interpretation as are the plays themselves. And of Monika's work, Shakespeare's Tercentenary is the first extensively documented and critically enriched survey of the 1916 celebrations on both sides of the Atlantic. This monograph addresses a topic essential to grasp Shakespeare's presence in the early decades of the 20th century, and it will equally appeal to Shakespeare scholars, historians, and students of cultural memory. No other scholar has Monika Smialkowska's sheer breadth of understanding of the global impact of the Shakespeare Tercentenary and the extraordinary variety of uses to which Shakespeare was put in 1916, from patriotic to pacifist, from imperialist to anti-colonial, from racist to racially empowering. This is a fascinating and original study of the place of Shakespeare in global collective memory. So we normally have a chair for these discussions, but today my wonderful colleagues are actually going to be conducting this event themselves, which is great. So let's have a hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine, for that introduction, and to Torch for hosting this event, and to all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to be sharing this spot with Monika, whose work I've drawn on and benefited from for a long time, memorializing Shakespeare with Edmund King and countless articles and chapters. And we've been lucky enough to work together. Monika contributed a chapter to a collection called Shakespeare at War, Material History that I co-edited with Sonia Masai, and also lent items to an exhibition that we co-curated at the National Army Museum in London called Shakespeare and War, which was open for about a year but has closed last month. So it's great to be able to continue the conversation here. and this time to discuss our two books and some of the overlapping topics, interests, material that they cover. As will become very clear, if it's not already clear, there's a clear difference between the approach that both of our books take. My study, Wartime Shakespeare, covers theatre history, beginning in the 17th, 18th century and going right through to the 21st century. Monika's study offers a more focused approach to Shakespeare at times of conflict, using the Tercentenary in 1916 as a springboard for looking at the significance of Shakespeare and acts of commemoration during wartime. So hopefully those different approaches will be an important part, a fruitful part of our conversation today. So the way we'll structure this, both of us will read an extract from our books and give a little sense of what our books cover. We then have some questions that we'll put to each other before opening the floor to all of you to ask any questions that you would like. So I will hand over to Monika to read from her book.
Thank you very much, Amy, for this wonderful introduction. We are just going to go chronologically because the little bit of the book that Amy is going to read out from hers is about Second World War. And my book is set during the First World War. So I'll go first and try to kind of open up this discussion to see what it was all about in 1916. It just seems a bit weird to write a whole humongous book on 1 year, but I hope it will become clear why it was important. What did Shakespeare mean in 1916? It was the year of the 300th anniversary of his death, which under normal circumstances would be expected to occasion worldwide commemorations. But the circumstances in 1916 were far from normal. The Shakespeare Tercentenary coincided with unprecedented political crisis across the globe, marked by the battles of Verdun, Jutland, the Somme, and other ongoing hostilities of the First World War. The Easter Rising in Ireland, rebellions against Russian rule by the indigenous people in Central Asia, and the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. As Keith Jeffrey points out, 1916 ushered in a crisis of the British imperial project and the demise of the Habsburg, Ottoman and Russian empires. These developments, characterized by the severing of the ties that used to bind large, multi-ethnic states and the strengthening of individual nationalist impulses, paved the way for the new global order of power, which emerged following the war. Consequently, the Shakespeare Tercentenary, to use Gordon MacMullen and Philip Mead's phrase, lies at the cusp of the imperial and the post-imperial, the pivotal moment when the balance of power began to shift from old empires to emerging nation-states. Amid such global upheavals, would anybody memorialize the fact that Shakespeare died 300 years before? The answer turned out to be a resounding yes, as 1916 witnessed a worldwide explosion of commemorative activities. Theatrical productions, sermons, concerts, exhibitions, souvenir publications, pageants and masks, planting of trees and Shakespeare gardens, and even such odd-sounding offerings as a Shakespeare suffrage soiree, Shakespeare circus, and waffles a la Shakespeare. One might ask, what made people focus on the literary anniversary instead of more pressing political issues? Such a question, however, sets up a false dichotomy between the Shakespeare Tercentenary and contemporaneous politics. As scholars of the Tercentenary have demonstrated, the 1916 Shakespearean commemorations had distinct political aims and implications. Pioneering research by Bals Engler and Werner Habicht initiated the explorations of the ways in which nations already embroiled in the Great War used the anniversary for propagandistic and diplomatic purposes. Britain and Germany in particular competed to claim Shakespeare as their own and enlisted him to generate patriotic enthusiasm at home and to forge alliances abroad. Meanwhile, as Thomas Kartelli and Coppelia Khan showed, the still neutral US used the occasion to address anxieties concerning American national identity in the wake of demographic changes caused by the turn of the century new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Mass participation Shakespearean events became opportunities not only to honor Shakespeare, but also to unify disparate ethnic groups and integrate recent immigrants into American culture. Finally, Kahn's seminal article, Remembering Shakespeare Imperially, paved the way for investigating how the British Imperial Centre's efforts to use Shakespeare to interpolate and control its colonial subjects were met with those subjects' counter-narratives, revisions and reappropriations. Kahn's suggestion that some tercentenary tributes constructed multicultural Shakespeares and exposed the contradictions of empire was developed further in several studies of the 1916 commemorations in colonial contexts such as Ireland, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, which flash out the image of Shakespeare as a vehicle for interrogating the hybrid and rapidly fracturing British imperial identities. All these cases indicate that celebrating Shakespeare in 1916 did not replace an engagement with current affairs. Instead, it constituted one way of reflecting and participating in those affairs. As empires battled for world domination and nations sought self-determination, Shakespeare was used to create a sense of belonging to diverse, often competing groups. He was seen as worthy of not only venerating, but even fighting over, as owning, sharing, or refusing to share him with others could signal who you, your allies, and your enemies were. So this book builds on and expands the current critical understanding of the socio-political implications of commemorating Shakespeare in that momentous year. Since most existing scholarship consists of case studies of Shakespearean tributes in individual locations, our knowledge of the Tercentenary remains fragmentary and incomplete. This book is the most comprehensive exploration of the anniversary's global dimensions to date, juxtaposing a wider array of national contexts than any previous study on this subject, as it brings together Shakespearean commemorations across Europe, the British Empire, and the United States. Moreover, my archival research has brought to light accounts of previously unknown tercentenary contributions, demonstrating that the celebrations extended way beyond the well-documented events in London, Stratford-upon-Avon, New York, and a few colonial locations. Most importantly, I have found that even within apparently unified nations, the 1916 Shakespeare commentators did not speak with one voice or follow one official script. For example, provincial British and American communities, as well as ethnic and racial minorities in the US, marked the anniversary in ways that often questioned or challenged the homogenizing narratives produced by the political elites involved in the mainstream celebrations. Analyzing those hitherto forgotten contributions alongside the dominant tercentenary strands paints an unexpectedly multifaceted picture of Shakespeare in 1916. He was not simply or exclusively the patriotic bard used by officialdom to support totalizing versions of national or imperial identity. Instead, he proves a site of debate and contestation in which multiple identities and priorities, local and global, nationalist and universalist, militant and pacifist, centralizing and marginal, combined and clashed in a fascinating, open-ended dialogue.
Okay, thank you, Monika. So I will follow on from that by reading an example from my 5th chapter, which focuses on the Second World War. As a bit of background, Karl von Clausewitz famously remarked that war was the continuation of politics by other means. And I think a a glance through theatre history suggests that the use of theatre and the use of Shakespeare can often be seen as a continuation of politics and of war by other means. To draw on the phrase proposed by playwright and theatre director Suleiman Al-Bassam, Shakespeare offers a kind of playable surface, and his plays have been used and adapted and mobilized for various purposes throughout centuries of conflict. My reading comes from a section in my 5th chapter. During the Second World War, British theatre was sponsored by the British state for the first time in its history through 2 main organisations, the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, or CEMA, and the Entertainment's National Services Association, or ENSA. Broadly speaking, CEMA provided entertainment at the home front, and ENSA provided entertainment for troops and military forces towards the front line of conflict. This is a short discussion of a production of Macbeth that toured in England and Wales. So in 1940, an Old Vic CEMA production of Macbeth, starring Lewis Casson and Sybil Thorndike, toured mining villages in Wales and presented its title character, played by Casson, as a dictator resembling Hitler. The production, performed for many audiences who had never seen live theatre, later toured to North Wales and North East England, and approving accounts spread beyond Britain. The Washington Post applauded Casson and Thorndike, who were real-life husband and wife, who took the play, quote, in a simple production to the most remote provinces of the British Isles, and reportedly had great success in stirring audiences with the timeliness of the situations and the thrusts in the speeches at usurpation by blood, domination by force, and the horrors of Macbeth's Gestapo among his people, end quote. Casson had been appointed CEMA's honorary drama advisor in April 1940, and he suggested that they should take Macbeth to villages in South Wales on a tour partly sponsored by the Miners' Welfare Commission. CEMA objected to Casson's proposal, which some thought would be, quote, too heavy for mining audiences, end quote. Casson persevered, however, claiming that he knew his countrymen and that they like a tragedy. The production featured minimal costumes and a small cast, which resulted in a heavily cut and adapted play that was performed in miners' halls, parish halls, cinemas, and work canteens, and only very rarely in a theatre. Newspaper reviews and reports tended to stress its small scale and modest proportions. The Manchester Guardian praised Thorndike and Casson's pocket-sized production of Macbeth, but how large in spirit, they described it, seeming to intimate the value and even superiority of this kind of contribution that testifies to a confident wartime spirit and the importance of individual contributions to the war effort, no matter how modest. The production itself attempted to do more than boost audience morale and support for cultural programmes. It directly applied Macbeth to the ongoing war, most overtly through a plainclothes prologue written by Lionel Hale at Casson's invitation. This prologue featured Casson and Thorndike as themselves, along with 2 of the company's actors who discussed the choice of play for performance. Casson and Thorndike take on the voice of authority, not only as the company members responsible for repertory choices, but also as educators who guide the interpretation of the play. Here is some extracts from this dialogue. Thorndike: we want a good play, and this is a good play, but we want something more than that. Though it was written over 300 years ago, it has got to mean something today. It has got to be true for 1940. The 2 actors remain unconvinced about the relevance of a play set 1,000 years ago in Scotland, at which point Thorndike and Casson attempt to guide the interpretation of it. First actor: it's a legend about a savage time. Second actor: Macbeth was a chieftain, he murdered Duncan and made himself king. He had to go on murdering to keep himself in power, with a spy in every house in Scotland, and so on. Thorndike, and you still don't see what this has to do with 1940? First actor, no. Thorndike, don't you? You've just given the perfect picture of a dictator. First actor, yes, but Casson, you needn't always think of dictators in terms of concentration camps and tanks and aeroplanes. Men don't change in 1,000 years. What Macbeth wanted, what all such people want, is power. This is a play about a tyrant, a dictator. So the prologue explicitly positions Macbeth as a topical play, the title character and his supporters resembling Hitler and the Gestapo. It was not, therefore, an example of escapist wartime theatre that was calculated to take people's minds off the war, but instead had a didactic purpose that aimed to elicit the audience's united condemnation of Macbeth as Hitler and engender support for a war that positioned the ongoing conflict as part of a narrative about resistance to tyrants throughout history. And I wanted to draw on that extract because I think it was quite useful for illustrating some of the typical ways in which Shakespeare is used during wartime. So sometimes cuts are made, additions are offered to texts to make the wartime application clear and apparent. But what interests me throughout this book, and one of the core arguments that I explore, is the extent to which even quite clear applications like this actually open up multiple possibilities for meaning and understanding. And that's particularly linked to the conditions of production of wartime theatre. Theatre involves script revisers and editors, actors, designers, sponsors, often government agents who take a part in overseeing a production, audiences who respond to and use and report that production, reviewers as well who circulate reviews and summaries of what they contain. And all of these different agents of production and reception often bring their own agendas to it and often shape and reinterpret the play in their own distinctive ways. And I think what I've found in this book is that that is often the key to why Shakespeare can become so malleable and usable during periods of conflict. Now that we've sort of set the scene a little bit for our books, I think we'd like to both begin by addressing the scope of our books. So I'll ask Monika first. What were some of the challenges of writing a book that concentrates on the Tercentenary year, and how did you decide on the parameters and scope of your book?
Yeah, the initial challenge could be to think it's just 1 year. Mm-hmm. How can I write a whole book about it? And I actually didn't set out to write a book. Mm-hmm. I was just looking at archive materials, and they kept on multiplying, and there was just so much and so much and so much more that eventually it just had to be a book. So it was kind of the material that led me. And obviously the themes started emerging, the key themes of national and social and sometimes racial identities. So it kind of started falling into place. But one challenge which I sometimes ever so slightly cheat. So kind of, obviously I should just be looking at 1916, but sometimes I need to say, oh, you know, that was already a continuation of something that started in 1914, or this African-American actor said that in 1915. So, because sometimes you don't have all the examples just from that 1 year. So that was, I think, the key challenge was to keep to 1916, but paint a broad enough picture so that it can show people that it matters. That it's not just kind of some antiquarian interest in 1 year, but this is actually the year that really had a very, very important meaning.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because I think that sense of you're using 1916 as that specific focus, but then looking for ways to incorporate a broader perspective and broader context into that. And I think in some ways I've approached my task with the need for both specificity and a broader perspective in mind, but in, I think, the reverse way. So taking this 300, 400 years of theatre history, but then looking at the same time for the specificity within that sweep of history. Because I mean, for me, I mean, Shakespeare has been so frequently used and invoked during periods of conflict. And the more that I was looking into it, the more surprised I was by how much material there is. I mean, you could spend several lifetimes just writing on this one topic. So, and I was sort of tempted by the challenges of trying something transhistorical, and how you would deal with that, and be able to identify a kind of through line, through argument amongst all of this very diverse, complicated conditions of wartime conflict and performance history. And I think one of the things that appealed to me, or I thought about often, was that short story by Borges of Funes the Memorious, who's this character who remembers everything in exact detail. And the narrator of the story says that this capacity to remember everything renders you unable to think, and that to think is to forget and to generalize and to make abstractions. And that's something that I've sort of thought often of as I've tried to find my way through this very diverse history.
Yeah, I think forgetting is quite an important part, because obviously part of what unifies my book is the idea of commemoration, because it's an anniversary, 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, but you also kind of come across what has been forgotten. What has been forgotten about those issues. Like, I've come across, in my opinion, very important texts that were produced during that time. Nobody has ever heard of them. There was an event produced by school children in Washington, D.C., by black schools, and that text of that play still exists, but nobody has ever heard of it. It was just buried in the copyright library. So you just kind of think, what do we preserve?
Yeah.
Which narratives survive till today? And very often it's those kind of dominant narratives. Oh yes, Shakespeare is the English national poet. But what does that mean? Does it mean, like, what is English?
Yes.
Again, I came across things that question the idea that Englishness is just one thing. And they come just from within, not even from within Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but just from England itself. So I think with it's kind of moving between remembering, forgetting, choosing.
Yeah, you're choosing what to remember, you're choosing what to forget, and I think that's the responsibility as a theatre historian, as a Shakespeare critic, to always keep that in mind, that it's never really you're never being able to grasp everything, and you are making a very clear decision about the things to include and the things to not to include. And I think for both of us, we wanted to move away from what we might have read or thought of before. I didn't want to suggest or to develop a linear narrative where we begin with Shakespeare in the 18th century and this kind of patriotic Shakespeare who's always used to support conflict, and then maybe that changes post Second World War, and now Shakespeare's a figure of critique often for conflict, but actually that there are continuities, there are grumblings throughout Shakespeare's history of being used during wartime.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what I found so impressive about your book, that you actually don't fall into that trap of going, oh yes, those benighted people in the 18th century, they just kind of were belligerent and used Shakespeare as a kind of figurehead for warlike patriotism, and now we are so much more enlightened. Even in the most recent cases that you discussed, there are elements sneaking in. People who sponsor the ostensibly anti-war production of Henry V are actually British Petroleum, who had a stake in the war in Iraq, which the production ostensibly criticised.
Yes, this is Nicholas Heitner's 2003 production of Henry V at the National Theatre, so often labelled or described as an anti-war production, but it is also a production that was involved in or sponsored by BP, and as later unfolded, BP certainly had a stake in the invasion of Iraq. So it does qualify the simplicity of these kinds of labels that we sometimes associate with wartime productions. We mentioned already ideas of Britishness and Shakespeare as a national poet, so maybe we could talk a little bit about that. What does your book have to say about the connection between Shakespeare and national culture during wartime? Shakespeare as a figurehead for British culture?
Well, what happens in 1916, it's kind of quite clear that there is no such thing as one British national culture. And also that Shakespeare can be a figurehead for other national cultures as well. So probably the most interesting case is Germany, who are actually saying that Shakespeare was born in England by mistake. They pretty much just have this story in one of the texts I was looking at. Oh, there's this stork who got kind of confused and delivered him in the wrong house of John Bull and Mother Britannia. And the poor little Shakespeare had to endure this cold upbringing and suffer until the lovely foster mother Germany took care of him and started explaining him and propagating him. And the German narrative was that the British basically moved away from the kind of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic proper culture to the degenerate, commercial and Frenchified modern Britain. And only in Germany he's understood and cherished and stuff like that. So it was basically like he was pretty much German national poet to them. And similarly, within Britain itself, there were some communities who were seeing him quite differently to maybe what the dominant narrative was. So, for example, there were efforts to kind of promulgate the celebrations across all of Britain and the British Empire. And in some places, they went down better than in other places. So there are some quite funny little stories from Scotland when the Scottish people say, they're asking us to contribute to this Shakespeare Tercentenary. Oh, it's all very good and well, but actually Rabbie Burns is much better, and so we shouldn't, worry about Shakespeare. And it's quite telling that, those intellectuals in England have to promote Shakespeare. In Scotland, we don't have to promote Rabbie Burns. He's naturally Scotland's national poet. So it's kind of, there are those tensions. And one guy actually very explicitly says, oh, yeah, we can celebrate him fine, but as long as we don't send the money generated to London. So, fractured British, Scottish, English identities kind of, let alone what's happening in Ireland when just the day after Shakespeare Tercentenary Sunday, the Easter uprising breaks out and it's kind of explodes. Yes,
it's a very conflicted area, and I think whenever the term national poet seems to be used, it's always an invitation I think while it gestures towards something uniform, it's always an invitation to look for the specificity, isn't it? And to who is using this term and why, and what is ultimately the specific agenda behind
and what they mean by it,
what they mean,
which sometimes is very
is very different.
different,
Yes,
amongst different communities.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean similarly in my book, the first half of my book looks at 18th century into early 19th century conflicts, and the 18th century really is the time when Shakespeare emerges on a global stage as a national, as mobilized as a national figurehead for British culture, and that especially happens within conflicts such as the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, as well. And the way in which Shakespeare described it is as I'm thinking of Morgan's dramatic essay on Sir John Falstaff, where Shakespeare is a kind of cultural conqueror whose legacy, as Morgan puts it, it will not perish, and it will be found and kind of mapped onto, in this case, the landscape of America, the valleys, the mountains, the streams. There is nothing perishable about Shakespeare. So there's this direct link between a kind of wartime context and Shakespeare as a national figurehead exerting an influence over other countries and nations. And I mean, that's something that is just, it's a steady use and mobilization of Shakespeare, I think, across the centuries. There's a poster of, have you seen a play by Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, our national poet, which is a Second World War poster, and various headlines in newspapers would point out in the 20th century there is no greater national service than performing Shakespeare's plays. So it's always kind of invoked in this way. But I think similar to Monika, the things that stand out to me, thinking of this in a broader kind of conceptual way, would be the fragmentation that is ultimately underneath and underpinning a label like national poet or British poet, and also the variation in terms of whether that kind of description is used competitively or aggressively. I mean, sometimes you can see individuals drawing on Shakespeare in that way, in quite a personal way. Like there was a soldier in prison who is reading Shakespeare's plays and is writing about that experience and saying how it reminds him of being at home. It reminds him of being on a beach in England or walking in the woods in Sussex. And there isn't that sense of competitiveness or antagonism, but then you very clearly have in other instances, I think the Germany example is very good, that there is a fighting over Shakespeare that is taking place, and it's not only, it's also xenophobic in very clear terms.
And sometimes racist as well, because one argument the German side was making was that one reason why the English, as they call it, by which they mean the British really, have degenerated is because of the colonies. They are going native with all those people out there. So it's kind of really, it can be quite a racist discourse. But on the other hand, people kind of reverse it, and ethnic minorities in America in particular are using Shakespeare and this kind of elevated status that Shakespeare has to say, we read and understand Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. We are as sophisticated and as patriotic as other white Americans. Mm-hmm. So it's quite, that this argument cuts both ways. You can exclude, but also you can claim that you do belong by reading and interacting with Shakespeare.
Yes, yes, definitely. And yeah, there's while these labels can seem to be constructing something that is insular, yes, it's very much a case that there are, I mean, you looked at this within your book, and although my emphasis is on wars with British involvement, you know, the Americans during the American War of Independence are claiming Shakespeare. During the Iraq War, Iraqi and Kuwaiti theatre directors are using Shakespeare, most recently in Ukraine as well. Ukraine has been, Shakespeare is a significant figure, specifically at the early stages of the conflict. Zelensky proposing to, in a call to British Parliament, that, you know, the question for Ukraine is to be or not to be, and it is most definitely to be. And similarly, theatre productions, again, using Hamlet, and this is tapping into, as scholars such as Irina Makarik have described this, a history of Russian translations of Shakespeare imposed on Ukraine, and the fact that to stage Shakespeare in Ukrainian has always been an act of resistance. So we can see the way that Shakespeare is used and very easily escapes the boundaries, the holds of this, you know, have you seen a play by Shakespeare, our national poet, that we can find in some uses. Yeah, so I mean, Hamlet for Ukraine seems to be quite helpful because of, in that play, that it is using Hamlet, this to be or not to be, to explore a kind of existential crisis that's linked to conflict. Looking back through and across theatre history, I mean, as expected, Henry V plays quite a significant role. Henry V is quite malleable as a play because it can be used to support military action. It can be quite a, you know, patriotic, celebratory account, depending on production decisions that might be made. But then it can also be used to critique war. But the one play that I found very consistently used, and I wasn't necessarily expecting this going into this project, was the Macbeth is really quite frequently used. And it seems to be that although one might think there would be a limit to the kinds of ways it could be used, sometimes clearly, you know, Macbeth's actions are condemned by a production. Macbeth is seen as a dictator, for example. Other times, productions play into a kind of anarchic appeal of what happens within this play. Other times, you know, you have sections of the cauldron scene, for example, taken out of context and used to support different views. So I think Macbeth was a surprise for me, and. Have you yours
in American
in America?
Context?
Yeah.
Yes, the big event in New York in 1916 was actually a reworking of The Tempest, and I've seen it described in one of the sources from the period as the Shakespeare's one American play. It's kind of all about the stuff, migration and discovery of those new lands. But even with The Tempest, it's quite interesting that same production, it was called Caliban by the Yellow Sands. It's all about the kind of civilizing process of this savage Caliban to become a citizen, pretty much like, you know, the new immigrants from horrible places like, you know, Southern Europe and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I mean, productions. I mean, there was certainly in Germany, we could the tour, the production of the Merchant of Venice that quite, I mean, racist production of Merchant of Venice that kind of plays into Jewish stereotypes. I mean, in terms of uses of Merchant of Venice within Britain, within the two organizations that I concentrate on, it's not as frequently used. So it seems to be quite mobilized quite a lot within Germany, and then leaves less of an important mark within British theatre. I don't know if you've looked.
Yeah, I haven't looked very much into it. I think there is a whole book about stuff like Second World War German uses of the Merchant of Venice. And I think the Germans found it tricky, because that play is not unequivocally anti-Jewish. What I came across with the Merchant was actually mostly United States uses. So I found a few sermons from the 1916 Tercentenary year by Jewish rabbis who chose to preach on Shakespeare. And one of the things that came up again and again was the Merchant of Venice. And at that time, they were debating whether that play should be taught in American schools. And the rabbis were very interesting. They are kind of like, they love Shakespeare. They just want, they want Shakespeare. And they say, oh yeah, but this play, after the story of the crucifixion, this is the play that there's a text that has done most damage to Jews. And they say it shouldn't be taught in schools, but for mature people, they can go and read it or watch it and things like that. So that's kind of quite an assertive position they take on it. And another case, which was also very weird, came from an Native American, the so-called Indian school. You know, kids were separated from their families. The Native American First Nations children were sent to these schools where they were being stripped of their identities and brainwashed into the white man's ways of thinking. And in one of those schools, Carlisle in Pennsylvania, they did a Shakespeare Tercentenary event. And they didn't do a whole play, they did scenes from the plays. But one of the speeches that one of those Indian kids performed was the "Hath Jew no eyes?" And you just wonder, you know, we've got absolutely no record of what this kid from Shoshone tribe was thinking. You know, was he thinking, has Shoshone no eyes?
The best speeches in the world.
Yeah.
About the equality
Yeah.
of people.
But so they did it, but you know, that's one of the frustrating things about our material. In that case, we've got photos of the kids who performed, and we've got a very brief kind of article written up by one of those children, young people, really not children. But it's so impersonal. They actually totally refused to tell us what they thought. They just say, "Oh, it was decided to do it. It was thought that would be appropriate," but they just don't say, "When I spoke that speech, I felt that, you know, it's like me." Absolutely nothing. So, you know, we can only kind of wish that we knew.
These archival absences that, you know, you know that something is happening, you know that this is relevant, that perhaps there would have been, you know, responses, thoughts, but we don't have the record to be able to piece it together.
I haven't looked at the recent situation, but what I know is that Russia has a very, very strong tradition of scholarship and performance of Shakespeare. So I wouldn't be surprised, I don't know, but it's a total speculation, if they were thinking along the same lines as the Germans during the First World War. You know, those degenerate Westerners, you know. It's kind of, I don't know if you've seen that Star Trek one in which this Klingon general says, "You don't understand Shakespeare until you have read it in the original Klingon." So I think possibly Russians might be kind of thinking, you know, they are... But again, it's just my over-interpretation based on older approaches, rather than I haven't looked into what's going on now.
Well, on that note, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Monika.
Thank you both.
Yeah,
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.